Alright, it's Monday morning. I've had a very busy weekend, not doing cameras, and it's time to move on with this Retina Reflex 3 project. So the shutter, I've completely stripped and cleaned all the componentry, so I've just got to reassemble this now. So, where does this plate go? That's my first problem of the day. Well, it's got 3 screw holes. We'll just try it in the first position. No, it's not there. It's not there. It's not there. Not there. Not there. What's the mystery? What's the secret? Well, there's one of the screw holes. No. Okay. Well, look at that. 3 holes all lined up. Everything else looks appropriate. That's good. Put these tiny screws back in place. And you might recall that these screws were loose when I took the shutter apart. And that is very uncharacteristic for these shutters. But it causes a problem if they are loose. If the screws back out, they can catch the shutter blades and jam the action. I'll check that those are all done up nice and snug. That's good. So that's the shutter case. That's easy because there's no diaphragm to worry about there. The mechanism plate, this has all been cleaned. Need to swing the blade actuating ring into position. Make sure that the pallet for the flash sync mechanism is not pointing the wrong way. Swing the detent spring into position over the post on the blade actuating ring. Of course, that immediately wanted to flick out of position. And that all gets held in place with the lens tube, which only fits in one position. Just check that pallet's stuck under that arm of the thing there. Just making sure those levers are back out of the way. Now there are 3 screws hold this in place. 2 of them are shorter than the others. The longest screw, which is about perhaps half a millimetre longer, perhaps less than that, holds this bracket in place. Can you see that? Here you can just see that. Okay. We're not putting that bracket back on now. We'll put that bracket on later. The bracket goes here where that pin is. The 2 shorter screws go in the other 2 positions on the lens tube. If you make a mistake and put the longest screw through there, it will stick out through the bottom of the mechanism plate and foul the shutter blades, which will be a nuisance. Means you'll end up having to strip things down again. Those 2 shorter screws go in here and here, I'm just check that they're tight. The third one I'm not putting in place yet because it holds this bracket in place, and this bracket, it's awkward to get the main cam and things in place with that bracket fitted. So that mechanism plate is basically assembled there, or the base of the mechanism plate. I want to lubricate this now with a little bit of graphite powder. I like to use graphite powder to lubricate this because graphite powder doesn't dry and get sticky with age, unlike most wet lubricants, most greases. And I suppose I could judiciously use some molybdenum paste in there instead. But I'm old and I'm set in my ways, and I've been using graphite powder for decades and decades, so I'm not going to change. Not at this late stage. So basically I just wanted to work a bit in there, make sure that's all moving smoothly. And that's the mechanism plate ready now to have the shutter blades assembled to it. So I just first need to swing the blade actuating ring around into this position where it's up against that tube. That's in the blade's open position now. And I realise I don't have my all-purpose handy piece of dirty old block of wood here to support things. Never mind. I've got my shutter blades and they've all been cleaned. Oh, there's a stray spring. How did that get into that container? Well, I know what that's for. We'll deal with that later. Okay, so the shutter blades. There's 6 blades in all. 4 of them are identical. One of them is deeply cut away at the back here to clear the shaft through the shutter. And this one is the cover blade, or the 6th blade. So we'll start with the plain blades, and I need a nice clean toothpick to help me manipulate these blades into position. And blade number 1 goes here, and it's one of the plain blades. These blades are going on. We've set the mechanism plate into the... better do this right. This goes here. This blade goes here. And you can see the reason for that cutout now, because that a shaft comes through at that position. Oh, come on back, you. Yes, I'm somehow managing to stay on in camera, that's good. And the cover blade covers the position of the first blade. There we have it. Now normally I want to swing my my blade actuating ring in slightly so that the blades are not right out at the edge of the circle here, because otherwise it's exceptionally easy to catch them on the case as you lower the case over and ping them out of position, whereupon of course you've got to fight them start again. So getting this case lifted over carefully over that post and holding it between finger and thumb without getting my fat greasy finger on a shutter blade. I'll run a screw in there to hold that, and just run that screw in lightly. There are 3 screws, and the reason I'm doing these up very lightly is if one of the blades has slipped out of position and is caught between one of the pins and the plate, it would be damaged. And it's just check that the action of the shutter blades is good, they're all swinging in and out neatly. I can tighten those 3 case screws up. We hold back this tab. This tab is held back by the self-timer. When the self-timer is set, that's allowed to fall in and block the action until the self-timer pulls it back, which would allow this to move. And this piece here is from the flash sink. But with those out of the way, I can swing my blade actuating ring backwards and forwards, and you can see the blades move in and out smoothly. At this stage, I'm hunting around for the jig that I normally sit this in, and of course I'm not prepared, so I've got to go and find it. The jig I use is this, which is the front of the body off a Retina Reflex, or S I'd say. So it makes a marvellous jig to hold the shutter while I'm working on it. Now I can think about putting back all the internal components, and the first things to worry about are the springs. Let's find out which tray I've carefully hidden those in. This one, okay. The one that looks empty to a casual glance because the springs are very small. Right, I'm going to swing this round so you can see what's happening. This spring goes over that post. That didn't take long, I've lost that toothpick already. Okay. Now, whenever you're manipulating small springs like this, you need to be able to make sure they're not going to spring off the post. Now, I normally do that by holding a toothpick or something over the post so that the spring cannot get away. Now I've got to lift the tail of that spring up and over and behind the stud on this lever. So this lever is now sprung loaded and this lever is sprung loaded. The next spring is our return spring for the B lever, and that goes over the post here, and the short end of the spring hooks over this lever here. Next component in here is the B lever. No, it was there all along, it was just disguised. I'm sure this was all much easier years ago when my eyes worked well. Never mind. Let's get this B lever in place. Right, so first I'll open the shutter blades in open position so that the B lever can drop down into the blade actuating ring. See it on camera? Yeah, you can still see it, good. Hook this into position and drop it over the post. And the screw that retains this and its spring. Now the screw is a post, so you just got a little slot either side, and I need to find a special screwdriver to do that up. Well, that screw was well hidden, the screwdriver was well hidden, but I did manage to find it. Of course it wasn't invisible, it was sitting out in plain sight. It was just disguised as something else. See if I can get this on the screwdriver. That's it. I wedged that onto the end of the screwdriver, and now I can see if I can get this in position. That went unusually smoothly. I'll check to make sure it's all good. Looks okay. I've got to swing the tail of this spring over now against the lens tube. Check that the spring's tucked down correctly. On the correct side of this lever, it is. That all looks good. B lever is good, it's tucked in correctly. If I hold back the B lever with my finger, I can pull the blade actuating ring back to the rest position. And at this stage, I'm just going to apply a little bit of molybdenum paste to the detent spring here and the post it runs over on the blade actuating ring, and check that that action is smooth. Let's hold this lever back. That's good. You don't normally have any trouble with that, but occasionally, just very occasionally, I've struck a detent spring that for one reason or another isn't as smooth as it should be, and it actually rubs on that little post it runs over and doesn't move as smoothly as I'd like it to. Not very often, I have to say, but just occasionally. Alright, well that all looks good. And at this stage, here is the pallet wheel for our flash sink. And drop that into position. And here is the little sector arm which drives it, and I'll put a spot of molybdenum paste on the tip of that lever where it catches and is held back in the cocked position, and I've got to pull that lever back so that that can drop down. That's dropped down, that's good. And now I can fit its spring, which runs between the hole in the arm here and that post there. And this is quite a stiff spring. I use needle nose pliers to pull this into position. I hook the loop over that post, pull this out and drop it into the hole in the arm. So now that arm will cock. That's the cocked position, that's where it would be when the shutter is cocked. And as soon as the shutter blades start to open, this is released, it drives the wheel, which is timed by the pallets, and that mechanism determines when the shutter will open after the flash contacts have made when set to the M position. The flash contacts make before the shutter fully opens on the M position. That's for using flash bulbs. And that's because flash bulbs take a measurable length of time to burn up to peak intensity, whereas electronic flash is for most practical purposes instant. Right, so start assembling the flash sink componentry. Just put a smear of molybdenum paste in the centre of that lever, drop that into place, make sure its spring is against the case there, it's sitting down firmly. If they're moving, flash contact sits on top of that. Make sure that's seated correctly. If I bring this into the cocked position, it allows me to drop the top cover piece in place. I have to make sure that this is sitting correctly. This little lever here should be sitting out towards the centre. This of course has just got to be inside the case. Oh, you would do that, you bugger. It should just drop down over the pivot, except that it's Monday morning and it doesn't want to. That's better. There we go. So you can see that this arm is free to move because we've got this in the cocked position, and this little arm here is towards the centre. It's not tucked up behind anywhere. That's good. 2 small screws hold that in place. I'll just get that. The plain screw goes at this end. Whoops, that's just fallen out and it's hiding down here in the shutter. Get that back out. Checking that's all good. There's a spring goes on at this end, the return spring for this arm. That sits there. Now the screw has a shoulder that the spring will run around. You've got to be careful that the spring is free to turn around that shoulder and you haven't trapped it underneath the shoulder. That looks good. Check those screws are tight and swing that spring into position. So lift it over, it drops into a slot in the back of this arm. You'll see that's working smoothly. Here's our shutter release lever. There's not much to do with shutter release levers. I normally give it a very small wipe of molybdenum paste on the shaft where it pivots. Need to make sure that it's on the underside of this B lever here, and its tail, its spring, needs to be lifted get this in position. The spring needs to be lifted right over the top of that screw, and it actually gets tucked down on this side, on the underside of that mechanism. It has quite a strong return spring, much more so than it would do on one of the rangefinder cameras. With the rangefinder cameras, the spring is more generally tucked up against the edge of the case. Here it's swung right round here instead. So that's all in place. I'm going to put a bit of molybdenum paste on the main drive cam. I'm running some around the curved edge. Don't need as much as that. Wipe a bit on those surfaces. Molybdenum paste, you need very little of it. Let's get this thing settled down in place. Normally you've got to pull this arm back to allow that to drop down easily. What are we hanging up on? That's better. With that in place, I can put the bracket on that holds the spring for the main cam and the third of the screws for the lens tube. This is the longer of the 3 screws. Take the opportunity to check the other 2 screws are tight. That's good. Now the main drive spring. Here's our main drive spring. And looking at this, the tab sticking up, if we said that was at the 12 o'clock position, the other little one up and pointing up directly this way, vertical here, is at roughly the 3 o'clock position. That's not bad. When they were new, you could say that this would have been sitting at the 2 o'clock position. The spring would have had more tension. But over time these things have just got tired, and one of the reasons they've got tired is probably that they are being pushed to the absolute limit of what you could reasonably expect a spring to do, of that size, of those dimensions, doing that particular job under that amount of tension. So when the cameras were comparatively current, if you were doing a full shutter service, you would have replaced that spring as a matter of course with a new shiny one that was all lively and happy and pleased to be working hard. But of course now there are no new parts because the cameras are 60 years old. You just have to do the best you can. This is, as I say, is in quite a good example. So with the shutter cocked, we release it, the shutter fires. So that all looks good. I'm quite pleased with that. My speed train, my retard gear train, and my self timer or delay action, they've both been cleaned, and I don't think I've lubricated those yet. Doesn't look like it. I'm going to lubricate those with a bit of graphite powder. I typically use graphite powder to do that job. I have, with the self timer, you could very probably use some watchmaker oil and just on the pivots of the wheels, and that would probably work reliably. That would probably be okay. With the retard gear train, just ran out of card space there. I was just saying I haven't found that watchmaker oil on the pivots of the retard gear train has been useful for me. I've found that it's made the thing drag, just run a little slow and not quite so reliable. So I always lubricate these with graphite powder and nothing else. Now the graphite powder is probably not lubricating the pivots to any great extent, but it probably does impart some lubrication to the teeth of the wheels as they roll over each other. But regardless of the theory of it, I found it good in practice, so I'm not changing my evil ways at this late stage. So I'll just lubricate these with a bit of graphite powder.